Yes. Hello and welcome. We are having a special conversation today in honor of a woman who, in many ways, has shaped all of our lives just through the word becoming flesh, unfortunately. We'll get to that in a second. Let me say hello and welcome. We're going to talk about Octavia Butler today, and we're joined by the great Lurie Daniel Favors. You can listen to her on SiriusXM. She is on the Lurie Daniel Favors Show. She is at the Center for Law and Social Justice because she's a justice warrior. Lurie, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It is truly an honor.
No, my pleasure. And this woman is the reason why I even picked up Octavia Butler to begin with. It was a book, actually a series of books, My Soul to Keep and The Living Blood, that made me sit on my ass and go, wait a minute. And then when I had the pleasure of talking with her, she introduced me to Octavia Butler, and I said, okay, wait a minute. Let me welcome. She is one of the best writers that I know, living or otherwise. And she's an amazing teacher as well. The great Tananarive Due. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm also honored to be here.
Listen, when I picked up Parable, first of all, I went to I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, the exegesis.
I say xenogenesis, but
xenogenesis.
I don't.
It's got an X in it. I'm horrible with the pronunciations, but yeah, I started with that. And then I hit the parable of the sower, parable of the talents. And it starts July 20th. The book opens up July 20th. And I'm thinking about Lurie because she's born in July 2023.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah. And I'm like, exactly.
We're almost there.
Exactly.
In every way.
And she's laughing. She's laughing with the baby grand, with the grand piano behind her. So let's just
hysterical laughter is all. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, really, Octavia Butler, first, before we get into July 20th, 2023 and the book, tell me about the first time because you actually knew or met her and had conversations with her at Tananarive Due. Tell me what it was about Octavia Butler that inspired you.
Wow. I can really say I wish I had discovered Octavia earlier in my writing life. I've been writing since I was about 4, and I started writing Black girls sneaking onto spaceships. But by the time I got through the canon in graduate school, I was writing white men having epiphanies. So I had lost track of myself and my stories. And that's my one thing is if I had just read Kindred when it came out, if I had just read her earlier work, even Dawn, the Xenogenesis series is a little sciencey, it's I don't usually recommend those first because of the biology. But I would say specifically when it comes to Parable of the Sower, yes, I was lucky enough to meet Octavia in 1997 at Clark Atlanta University, where I also met my husband, Stephen Barnes. So there was this whole Black speculative fiction conference and just starting to feel family. I was somewhat in awe of her. I was afraid to say something silly, so I would just listen to her and Steve talk a lot of the time. But then Parable of the Sower came out and just blew me away with its really unblinking and harsh vision of the future Octavia was convinced we're marching toward. And that, I think her honesty is a thing, and the fact that she uses the speculative as the mirror to show us ourselves are the two things that really, really stand out about her. I could go on and on about Parable of the Sower. I'm sure we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But that's, I had a white science fiction writing friend who said, oh, if you're writing a book about an immortal African, My Soul to Keep, I was writing My Soul to Keep, you need to read Octavia Butler's book about an immortal African. And I was like, shoot, oh no. I was so, and I ran out and I found Earthseed. And then I was just so relieved, to find that her character Dora was nothing like my immortal African, but also more importantly, that I had been introduced to such a powerful voice in Octavia's work.
Lurie, when did you discover Octavia Butler?
It's interesting. I first came to Parable of the Sower, which was my introduction to Octavia's work. So if you're going to start somewhere, you might as well go all in. And I actually picked it up right after I'd finished the bar exam at NYU, right as Hurricane Katrina was about to land. And so I was taking in this work and taking in the messages, and really, for me, it was prophetic. I think she was convinced that that's the future we're marching towards. I believe she had some insight that may have indicated, yes, this is where we're going. And so to read that book after the trauma of law school and the bar exam, what would have been sort of its own thing. But to read those words on those pages as I was watching the Black bodies on the screen that were being completely abandoned, and seeing that it didn't matter if your house was on fire in New Orleans, there was nobody that could come to put it out. It didn't matter if your house was underwater in New Orleans, which is really the issue with the floods. There was no aid that could be brought in to help you. Seeing people trapped on their roofs reminded me of being trapped in these little insular communities that she describes in the opening paragraphs, in the opening pages of Parable of the Sower. Small insular communities that were forced into that sort of state of dysfunction because of the broader dysfunction of the governing bodies around them. So to see the government failure in Katrina, which resulted in the devastation of Black lives in New Orleans and in the South, and to be reading a futuristic version of something that feels oddly today, many years later, after that moment of reading it, and for the first time, very much like I'm literally living what she talked about in the 90s. It was a very surreal moment, but for me, it's always been one that grounded me firmly in the belief that I believe Octavia Butler is a prophet, which worries me because of where all of her work ends up taking us.
I mean, and let me correct myself, and thank you, Lurie, July 20 of 2024. I didn't pick up the book, of course, until Tananarive Due told me about Octavia Butler. And I was like, so there's somebody equally as dope as you? Okay. But I read it before Trump, right? And then Trump happened shortly after. Make America Great Again. All of these themes about building walls. Woo. And I'm like, God. And I want to spend a little time talking about God with each of you as well. You know, but yeah, she was a prophet. She was a prophet. She was able to see a world that we might have been living in, because that's the funny thing about time, right? You know, as you're approaching something, things are already in motion, right? We don't arrive at a place like overnight. There are things in motion that, well, and you mentioned Hurricane Katrina, which I had forgotten, not that I forgot about Katrina, but that eerily similar abandonment of humanity, you know. The message, you know, as you go through, and why did she do 2 books instead of 3? Tananarive, did you get a chance to talk with her about that?
She wanted to do the third. I feel, this is just me talking, you know, she didn't confide in me, but I really feel like there were a couple things at work. I mean, she very publicly did suffer from depression, and I think she was taking some medication that it made it hard for her to write. But when she was able to write again, rather than going to the third book, which would have been called Parable of the Trickster, where I think they would have been in space, I don't know that she felt like she knew how to write that novel, or was still in love with that novel, and she went to Fledgling instead, right? Which was her last novel. But I want to go back to something you said, because I did have the pleasure of not knowing her well, but having had many conversations with her, sometimes just sitting in the corner listening to her talk to Steve. But she really, really did have her eye on where we were headed as humanity. Okay, a lot of her writing is around Black women and Blackness and slavery, or themes that come up. But Octavia was writing first and foremost as a human being. And she really genuinely believed that we were marching toward disaster. There was one conversation in 2000 where Steve and I were interviewing her and kind of said, you know, you tend to be kind of pessimistic. And she was like, what? That's my best Octavia impression right there. And she kind of laughed, but she said, but look at us. Look at us. We keep marching to the brink. She talked about climate change. I mean, she was just breaking it all down. And she really felt like her novel Dawn, which was the Xenogenesis series where humans basically get taken over by an alien species. She was really trying to sort of point away, like, we're going to march toward nuclear war, but maybe if we had some intervention, it could be different. And then with Parable of the Sower, she said right there that it was religion that she chose as the intervention in that case, right? Like if this girl, which is ironic because Octavia had fallen away from traditional faith and Christianity, but she really did understand the unifying power of faith to help create movement and rebuilding. So she felt like having this teenage girl, Lauren Olamina, create a religion called Earthseed was another example of hope in a book, by the way, that does not have a lot of hopefulness outside of that faith and religion, and God is change.
We should probably warn people. Yeah, happy endings.
Yeah, shoot.
Not so much. Yeah, a lot of trauma, a lot of trauma, a lot of trauma.
I sobbed at the end of Parable, sobbed.
God, I wrote on my paper God, because as I was rereading it, I was reminded that the bondage that many people in this country, in this world, particularly Black people, the chains of bondage and slavery are directly linked to the chains and bondage of that Bible. And I'm gonna say that with my full chest right now. And the way in which religion has indoctrinated us into a hope for a better tomorrow and an afterlife, and not calling on our quote unquote better angels in this life to tap into our humanity in this life, to see one another in this life as brothers and sisters, which I think was the message when she, her daddy was a pastor, and, and she's, being baptized. Now, I don't want to give away too much, but, and she's questioning everything, which is something that I challenge everyone here to do, to ask yourself the question that was asked in this first book, what is God to you? How does God show up for you? And I thought that was just asking that question could free a lot of people, because I think a lot of us mindlessly follow something that we can't even define.
One of the things she does on that notion or that question about who is God or what is God, and she sort of breaks down all the things that God is not for her, right? And she was like, for some people, it's the daddy. For some people, it's the king or the benevolent benefactor. But what if God is none of those things? What if God doesn't really know you at all and just was the person who created the product and then backed away? And the idea that the only thing you could rely on is change, I think for people who have been indoctrinated in the way that you speak about or that you just mentioned, the idea of one, loosening the bounds of this benevolent white father God. And I'm going to say white because we traditionally, if we have a Black Jesus in our church, it is a form of resistance. It is certainly something that has to stand up against the indoctrination that sees Jesus or God in some other way. But if we are talking about a God who is really only concerned with change, that's at once really frightening for people who have come to rely on this sort of interpersonal relationship with my best friend Jesus and God, as I know in the Christian tradition, into one that says, well, maybe Jesus is not your biggest fan. Or maybe God is not your, and I keep defaulting to Jesus, that's my own Christian indoctrination. Maybe God is not your personal super fan rooting you on and willing to forgive any and all wrongs that you commit. Maybe God has given us the ability to be gods on our own or in collaboration and in community. And perhaps by recognizing that, that might be the faith and our ability as the God mirrors here on earth to do something different than hope and pray for some outside intervention, but to really think about who is the God within us that we are supposed to be tapping into so that we really can manifest here on earth the heavens that we're all supposed to be striving for.
All the finger snaps to that, the whole idea of shaping change and shaping God that are so central to these Earthseed tenets do separate them quite a bit from what I will call just sort of lazy faith, which is, well, these words were written thousands of years ago by somebody who thought they were being inspired by God, so it must be true. While not noticing that there are passages about stonings and there are passages about slavery, and that Jesus never said anything, not a single word about homosexuality, but he did have some words about divorce. I guess that's inconvenient. So there's a tendency in lazy faith to pretend that your biases are actually God's biases based on a few words here and there, right? Just that you can just sort of just mix your biases in there with this idea of a stern judge who stands over all and will only forgive you under a very specific prescription. Whereas Earthseed kind of reminds me of like my grandmother. She was AME, but she was also Baha'i, right? And in New Orleans, you also have people, yeah, I'm Christian, but I also practice some Vodou, right? So you mix, and Earthseed is one of those religions that you can incorporate within whatever your personal faith is. It's not that there aren't some contradictions. This is not the eye is on the sparrow God in any way, shape, or form in Octavia Butler. This is not the God who's, like you say, rooting you on watching your every move. It's a God you shape. And in order for you to allow yourself to feel that you can shape God, you do have to recognize that God within you, that person within you who can create change and accept change. And both of those things are very important. I think the fact that the only lasting truth is change is like the most memorable of the Earthseed passages, is because it is just that powerful. That's what got me past the Trump election the next day. When I was dazed, I was like, how, what, I don't, how? And then I remembered the only lasting truth is change. And I was like, dang, she's right.
As you're talking, I'm reminded that Jesus was crucified.
Yes.
Like, you know, he came with all his love and goodness and feeding people and even turning water into wine, and that wasn't good enough, right? It wasn't good enough. So the very people to this day that will hold the Bible, whether upside down or not, thump it, and then hit people over the head with it, are the very same people who would have been standing there saying, give us the murderer, take that one up on the cross. And I think about Octavia Butler, who you talk about her, you know, depression, to be in this body, in this country, at this time, at the time that she lived, with that mind, with that vision and foresight, and to not have people necessarily see you, to hear you, to think maybe you're crazy, right? And so you put it in books, but it's not normal. Did you guys have any conversation about the fitting in thing, or the not fitting in thing, and what that all means? Because I know, you know, as I'm reading, I hear all of the rejection in those pages as well.
I'll say briefly, because I don't want to monopolize, but
No.
we didn't talk about that specifically. My husband Steve knew her for about 20 plus years. So it's very easy for people to characterize Octavia as a hermit. She was not literally a hermit. I mean, she did have a social life. She was friends with Niecy Shaw up in the Seattle area. She and Steve would have dinner, and Steve drove her places. So she was social, but she definitely had built herself basically the perfect laboratory for her creativity in her isolated lifestyle. You know, she lived by herself. She spent a lot of her time by herself. And I think that really fed her in some deep ways. Like, as Steve often says, she was the most pure artist he's ever known. Like, just nothing but the NPR, the news, the books, the research, the imaginary characters, and her eye on that ball, which is, how do we save humanity? How do we snap out of this march so that we don't go over the cliff? As she genuinely did think. She did not think we were going to be a long-lived species. She literally said that. I mean, she said we've been longer lived than maybe some others, but our technology is too far apace with our psychology. So as long as we have these sort of hierarchical kind of constructs, and we, you know, wherever we go, there we are, right? But
break that down for a second. Our technology is
too far ahead of our psychology, in the sense that we are still like the caveman in terms of other tribe bad. You know what I mean? That part of us is still so deep that it doesn't matter if we can go to Mars. You know, that movie, The Martian, with Matt Damon, is like the most honest, like, yeah, you get there and he's an a-hole. He's gonna try to hurt you.
still.
You know, that's who we are on one level.
All right, I'm gonna pause you. I'm gonna pause you with the pronouns right now, because I don't think that's how we are. So I want
to just say humanity.
No, I want to pause there too, because those of us who are humane understand. And I think anytime we incorporate that behavior into our own, you know, because there's a need. I was rewatching 60 Minutes, and they had, you know, the last slave ship, the Clotilda, and, you know, Barracone and Zora Neale Hurston, all the greats, right? Stories written about. And there was one white guy whose great-great-grandfather was the ship owner that snuck that ship in, right, with those beautiful souls in the holds of the ship illegally. He burned the ship, you know, sunk the ship, and he was, you know, he's like, so the commentator asked him, do you feel guilty? Do you feel? He was like, no, that wasn't me. I didn't do it, you know, but I'll apologize. So he goes to the Black people and he apologizes, and they cry and they hug him. And it bothered me. quite frankly, because our nature is to see one another as us. And you want to forgive and love because that's what's in you. But that's what these books are telling us. That's not what's in. If the 7-year-old could be walking down the street naked, half naked with blood running down her leg, something's fundamentally wrong. I don't care what stress we're under to rape and pillage children and women at will, which is a lot of it in this book. I'm giving away a lot, but there's a lot of it that disturbs my soul. And I know it would happen because it happens and it's happening as we speak. There are women missing. There's a whole sex trade, and they call it a sex trade, but it's slavery, right? In this country, in America right now. So it's difficult. We and us that, because we and us don't have that in us. I know that for a fact. I don't. I know you don't. I know you don't. And I know y'all watching don't, because you wouldn't be here.
So I am taken up by this idea that the use of technology is also culturally derived. So I'm reminded of the idea that we've had gunpowder for a very long time, but it was only a particular group of people that decided to produce handheld weapons of mass destruction. And when I think about this question about how culture and technology and our psychology all connect, I'm reminded of Malidoma Somé, whose book, Karen, we had talked about some time ago, of Water and Spirit, or the Healing Wisdom of Africa and of Water and Spirit. And when he talks about the differences in the ways that even understanding what it meant to be, here we would say, you're mentally ill. And their understanding in his community was, no, you are perfectly well, but you are tapped into dimensions that are not also the dimensions that the rest of us are tapped into. So you actually, when you see someone in America walking down the street, you be like, they talking to themselves. In other communities, they would say, no, they're talking to beings that are speaking to them. The problem is their channel is tuned to the wrong dimension for the place where their body is at. Their approach to psychological healing very different than a Western approach to psychological healing. So when I think about weaponry, or when I think about technology, I'm always thinking about what culture created it and which culture is wielding it for what purposes today. And so when we think about, again, going back to gunpowder, it was not always that we used gunpowder for AR-16s. There was a point where gunpowder was used for other things. We did not always have cannons, though we had gunpowder that preceded it. The question for technology for me is always which cultural norms are driving that. And so, Karen, when I listened to you and Dr. Carr talking on In Class with Carr, and there was one conversation that you all had where Dr. Carr talked about the fact that even the games that we play as children are culturally derived and reveal a lot about the health or the lack thereof of health for these communities. So in communal spaces, you will sing a Ring Around the Rosie type of song. You'll have a game where the goal is for the group to win, because in that community, if the group does not work together and prize working together over individual successes, how are you going to stand against a woolly mammoth? How are you going to stand up against a herd of wildebeest who are coming for you? I don't even know if wildebeest are carnivores, so I have no idea, carnivores, so I have no idea if that's and that's metaphor, but you see where I'm going. As opposed to cultures that play games like Red Rover, run Karen right over, where literally I'm running as hard and as fast as I can to bruck up your arms so you can't even hold on to each other anymore. And he talked about that in terms of the culture that you are situated in is going to fashion the norms and the rules for what that people find to be acceptable. Bringing this back to Octavia's work in Parable of the Sower, in an American cultural context, I am very hopeful about where we are going with our technology and the frame that I think a genius like Octavia Butler was operating from in her concerns about humanity had to, I think, be also incorporating the American Western culture that prides itself on warfare, prides itself on the destruction of weaker vessels. I wonder if we all were in a culture that prided ourselves on our success, defined our success by how well we work together, I wonder if she would have had the same fears about our use of technology. I wonder if our vision of Afrofuturism would take on the same sense of urgency that it does if the culture that was driving technology and technological innovation was one that centered on the wholeness and the interplay of humans needing to rely on each other as being controlled by people who pride themselves on war and warfare as a way to define victory.
Woo, you have said a sermon and a mouthful there. And a lot of these questions obviously are theoretical and philosophical. I mean, this is the water we swim in. this ocean that is American culture and society. That was what gave birth to Octavia. So her being othered as a Black woman in poverty, or even as a child, like in middle school, 6 feet tall, she's othered. So she was on the outside looking in. So when I say we, I'm not talking about the three of us, or, I'm not talking about the people it doesn't apply to. But there are people who get seduced by power, of all types, and ethnicities and genders. I mean, you get seduced by power, you lose your way. And Octavia definitely thought we, as a society, had lost our way. And one of the components that I think is the strongest and most devastating is this idea of denial, right? So in Parable of the Sower, for those of you who haven't read it, there's a teenage girl, Lauren Olamina, I think she's only like 15 when the book starts, who basically can see the storm clouds rolling in when her elders cannot. She has that thing that young people have when they can really see the truth of what is, without all the baggage and the excuses that we as older people have, because we already tried to fix it. Oh, it's always going to be that way. Young people like, this is wrong, we need to fix this. And she tries to warn her father, who's a pastor, the elders in her community, that this cannot sustain. These walls will not hold. We cannot create this enclave separate from the rest of society and expect them to leave us alone. And sure enough, it came to pass. But it was denial that made it so people didn't even want to hear about it, right? And I think that denial, to a degree, and I don't know how this translates over different cultures, I think that our fear of death is so strong, at least in American culture, that denial plays in on just that deepest level, that we're in denial about the relationships we're in. We're in denial about the things that we're doing, because that core denial is so strong. We don't want to believe we're going to die. That's just my philosophy, right?
This is why that they don't believe the Bible that they push on people, because I think that's the one thing in that Bible that keeps Black people going, that there's going to be streets paved with gold, and in my Father's house there's many mansions, and we're going to have no more crying and no more sickness, and there's hope for that, and I'm going to go to heaven and be reconnected. Like, we believe that. They don't. Those people.
Yeah, and look at what just happened with COVID. I mean, you need no better example. She didn't have a pandemic in Parable, but she could have. And by the way, Parable got on the New York Times bestseller list for the first time during COVID, because so many people were discovering her work. And the denial, the mask denialism, the COVID denial from the highest office in the land, it was mind-blowing, unless you've been reading Octavia Butler, unless you understand how deep some of these issues go. And I'm just going to say, the last major event I attended before lockdown was the opera version of Parable of the Sower at UCLA that Toshi Regan and her mother, Bernice Regan Johnson, composed around Parable of the Sower. It's part gospel, part rock, part funk. It's an opera. I Have You Seen My Father just brings tears to your eyes. Beautiful, beautiful music. And then we walked out into lockdown. And how deep is that? It was really extraordinary. But she did seem to know. Sometimes I think a prophet is just someone who's paying attention. But maybe she did have a little bit of that foreknowledge.
Well, I mean, she the main character, and I wonder what you feel about this, had a condition that made her empathetic, which we could all,
yes.
Which we all could, if you inflict pain on someone and you felt all the pain and pleasure that you could from all around, how differently would we act? And I wonder if maybe she actually had that herself, an ability, because this is what disconnects us from one another. The fact that we can't see each other's pain, we can't see each other, period, which is why people so cavalierly could not wear a mask, even though they're putting other people in jeopardy. Because if you saw that person as someone who could potentially catch something that could kill them, you would wear a mask if you had humanity, if you had empathy. What about that empathetic theme as well? Because that character's ability, not just to see, the stuff's about to hit the fan, but I can feel things. How powerful was that for her to put in there?
What I love is how she gains this skill. So out of which for me is so reminiscent of, I'm raised in the 80s and 90s, and what we were seeing in terms of the commentary about how, I don't want to give too much away.
But this is very early in the first book, so
Very early,
we're gonna
no,
find out.
no real spoiler, very early in the book. It's because of the drug use of her mother that allows her access to this skill that literally I think is part of the reason she's able to navigate all the things that she's able to navigate, and part of the reason that she is able to birth this new belief system and this recognition in people, because she literally embodied what that change looks like on a life and death basis. So when she says that she feels pleasure, not just the others, but so there's one point where she's talking about sex and how she is able to derive pleasure, not just from her own experience, but from the experience and the pleasure that her partner is having, but that's one of the only places where there is room for pleasure in this world, because the world has gotten so crazy. But because she can feel not just the pain that she thinks that they're feeling, but the pain, even if they're not feeling it, pain that she believes that they are feeling. There's this one example where she talks about the little brother who pretended that he was bleeding. He wasn't really, but she was so tuned into human suffering and human feeling that she begins bleeding, even though he's not, because her body was able to mimic what she thought was happening. I think if we had a smidgen of that sensitivity for other people, for how we are acting in the world and showing up in the world, how that is impacting people around us. And then thinking about how the actions of others are impacting people, not just in our own sphere of influence and concern, but literally our entire community, we would not have 98% of the horrors and travesties that we have right now. I just do not believe that we wouldn't, but that she gains that skill because of something society has been taught to despise, I thought was like the perfect example of the lotus flower blooming out of the muck and mire of the swamp.
Mm.
Beautiful.
As you're mentioning that, I wonder if Octavia, she made transition in 2006. So she didn't even get to see Barack Obama, right? I wonder if that would have made her hopeful. I don't know. Had she lived to see Trump, had she lived to see this pandemic? And how has it shaped your writing as well? What would have been different, do you think, about what art Octavia Butler would have produced, and for you, Tananarive Due, as somebody who's in it, who's teaching it as well, who's writing and producing art on many fronts? How has it shaped and changed what you put out?
It's so funny because ever since the pandemic, a friend of mine, the Reverend Dr. Monica A. Coleman, have been doing a monthly sort of webinar series called Octavia Tried to Tell Us under the hashtag Octavia Tried, if anybody wants to look at those videos. And the whole premise of that title, although Toshi Regan corrected us and said, no, she didn't try to tell us, she told us, okay, she didn't try. But that's what springs to mind when you ask that question. It's like, would she have been surprised? No, she basically foresaw the rise of a Trump-like cult figure in a Parable of the Talents. The only difference is that families who were American citizens weren't being kidnapped and taken away to camps, but certainly we saw an uptick in the immigrants who were being kidnapped and their children separated, and all the things, make America great again, that slogan, all that stuff is there. So none of that would have surprised her. I like to think that the mask denial and the COVID denial might have surprised her a little bit, but maybe not. And perhaps that would have fueled her. This is, again, pure speculation. Perhaps that would have fueled her to look more into Parable of the Trickster and this notion of the future in the stars, because that was actually her email address was Butler8star, not like star, I'm so famous, but I think star because she thought the future was in the stars, right? And maybe she would have wanted to sort of try to explore, not sort of giving up on Earth, but low key kind of giving up on Earth to say, what if we could start fresh? Not with this alien species like she did in Dawn and the Xenogenesis series, but if we could start fresh with equity, where it's not ruled by the rich, what kind of world would she have imagined? Would she have gone all the way down the tunnel of dystopia out to utopia? Now, I know it's a stretch, but how much more dystopia could she write? You know, I mean, it's
Right. So
it
she wrote
was
it all.
it
And
was
I saw you wince at rich because we all in this room are rich. So let me clear it up for anybody out there. And there's nothing wrong with wealth. We should all have it. We should all have it in abundance.
well,
But
I mean the billionaire class, I should say, the billionaire.
I think we all plan, I at least plan to be in that.
Okay.
But I think the difference is money in the hands of people who want to do good and who will, because you even hinted to the corruptibility of power. You know, the character ended up, and I won't give anything away, but there's an ascension of sorts, right? Of this character, right? Where there was a lot of power put in their hands, and they did right by that power. You know, I don't think absolute power corrupts. I think it's all in the humanity of the people who have it. And I want more people with humanity to have power and money so that things can be, is it possible, Lurie, to have a utopia? And what would it take? And I don't know if we can go to Mars because Black people aren't making spaceships. Are we? There's got to be an African out there, an African nation that can rival Tesla, whatever Elon Musk is doing, and Richard Branson. They can't be the only people with spaceships.
But I'll tell you one thing, I wouldn't get on one. Anybody's, I don't care who made it.
You don't care if it's the African one. You're not getting on Rwanda's space shuttle to nowhere.
Nobody.
Okay, nobody. So then we're only dealing with this Earth then. So is it possible?
Is utopia possible? I think it's possible. But I think the real question is, are we willing to do what it would take to build that? Are we willing to, and I'm not even so much interested in tearing down what already exists. Tearing something down is often where we put a lot of our energy. We got to tear down the system. We got to tear down the structures. We rarely think about what it would take to build something afterwards. And my brother is a civil engineer, and his role is to make sure that if a building is going up somewhere, that the ground can support it, that the foundation of the sand that it's going to be built on, that there's sufficient piping capacity. There's all these things that go into building a building before you even purchase a piece of material. And it takes like 3 minutes with well-placed dynamite to destroy said building. So in order to build that, I think going through a process similar to what we see this character go through, where she literally has to create and then convince other people to embrace a completely different relationship with the world around them, with each other, with themselves, and the relationship that they have with God, how that has to force change in their relationship to each other. And I think if we had a culture that was more healthily grounded in ensuring that the needs of the whole were being met, that would put us on a path. The challenge is, are we willing to do the work of unlearning the culture that we have, building the culture that we need in real time? Because I know we have had cultures that focused on this, but to the extent that those cultures were able to be infiltrated and destroyed by people with guns and a different cultural mindset, I think we would now say it's not enough to go back to what we had, even though that was flawed. We have to contend with the world as it is today. So I think in an ideal sense, I think it is possible, because I think we are African geniuses and we have the ability, we birth civilization, we can rebirth culture and rebirth civilization. I wonder if we have the capacity to build the institutions that can incubate that long enough for it to take root firmly enough so that it's not weed whacked to death or Monsanto to death, to stick with the gardening metaphor. Is it possible? Yes. Are we willing? I think is the more serious question.
So we'll let that sit in people's spirits.
I just want to add to that. I teach writing from time to time, speculative fiction at a workshop called Voices of Our Nation's Arts Foundation, which is for marginalized writers, speculative fiction. And each workshop, the class makes a presentation. So my class presentation was, one of the students had found a town that was for sale in the South. I forget the name of the town and I forget the state, but it was somewhere in the South, whole town for sale. So they basically created their version of a utopian society at this town. They weren't going to have a jail. This is what they were going to do for law enforcement. They would have this. They would welcome these people. They laid it all out. And I thought, isn't that beautiful? And then weeks later, I read a story that a group of Black investors in real life had actually bought that same town, right? Now, are they going to be able to create a utopia? I don't know. They're going to run into the same issues every new town runs into. You have to decide, what do you do when people step outside of the bounds of society and hurt other people? What do you do?
Banish them the way the Native Americans did.
How do you educate people? So I think we have to sort of change our idea of what it means. I think Earthseed is a good model because Earthseed starts small. It's like when my late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, was a civil rights activist in the 60s. There were only 3 or 4 or 5 people at those meetings in the beginning. And then it grows to the March of 1,000. And then it grows to a national movement, right? So I think we have to think in terms of smaller pieces and creating our personal corners of utopia. Sometimes it's just within your home is a utopia, meaning you're spending less time trying to tear down something else and more time trying to build up your own family. That's just one example, you know what I mean? So it's going to take time and thought and imagination.
Tananarive Due, daughter of Patricia, wife of Stephen, mother as well, beautiful child. As we wrap this up a little bit, and again, I want to direct people to your discussion. Octavia tried to tell us, is that the name of it?
It is, and we have an offshoot that we call, Shaping Change Workshop, Saving Ourselves, Shaping Change Workshop, which was kind of like a support group through the pandemic, but has continued. And if people want to check that out, it's at www.octaviawebinar.com.
I love it, because these are just breadcrumbs, and I want people to have an entry point into, the imagination of someone who absolutely, in my opinion, was a prophet and who saw the future. But I want it to be awakened in all of us. We all have, I think, the ability to see things if we just, tap into it. So this is tapping in. The most poignant passage in either book for either one of you that you just walked away and was like, damn, or wow, I didn't see that coming. Lurie.
So we didn't really go into the talents versus the sower, but it was the constant identification of technology from the 90s when she was writing it that I'm seeing show up in real life. So when she talked about the collars that were used for control, that to me was probably one of the scariest soul crushing things to read about, because that technology exists. That could happen right now. You mentioned the town that could be purchased. And when I think about recent journal articles talking about corporate entities buying up entire towns, buying up all of the single family homes, and literally being able to, so there was never one passage. It's always the impact that the whole thing has, but the collars that we see show up, those electric devices for control that we see show up in the talents, that is something that to this day, it makes my blood run cold, particularly because of all of the other things that had to happen for them to reach that point. And I see those things happening now.
It's just, it's not far-fetched at all that these independent groups of fanatics would feel empowered to go abduct people and enslave them. I mean, we have states legislating to make it legal to run over protesters with their cars right now. I mean, we're on that path, firmly on that path. So when I try to think of one thing that sticks with me, I went immediately to the Earthseed verses. When I wrote an essay on Inauguration Day in 2017, it took me since the election to finally finish it. It took a long time to put my thoughts together, but it was called Surviving President, Lessons from the 1960s in Octavia E. Butler. And the Earthseed verse that I opened that essay with was, belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. Belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. So, one of the things from my mother was, in the 60s, not everybody was marching. I'm afraid to go to protests. I'm not afraid to say so. If a police officer yanks me by the arm, that's going to be the worst injury I've ever had. I have never been subjected to violence. I'm blessed in that regard, but I can give money, I can sign petitions, I can support. So I think that even though often we feel small and that the problems are so large, we feel like there's nothing we can do. We must be in a constant state of doing even small things. If we believe in something, let's work toward it. And that's certainly what Octavia did, very much through her writing. And that's also a legitimate way to try to create change, is through art.
If I were really good at this, I would end this discussion right there, but I can't.
You are good at this. What are you
No,
talking
I can't. You know, I mean, there's a way to do this, you know, where, you know, production quality, that's the perfect ending, that statement by you, perfect ending. But I'm still like Kindred. So after I read Parable of the Sower and Talents, I picked up Kindred, which I think was that her first novel? 1979?
No, it wasn't her first novel, but it was the novel she wrote in response to critics who thought she should be writing about the struggle, because they didn't see how she was writing about the struggle through the funhouse mirror, you know.
Okay, so Kindred is a horror story that's worse than any Good House, worse than any Stephen King, It, or The Clown, or because it is a woman from now, or whenever the book was written, that gets transported back to enslavement and comes back and forth. I can't even imagine waking up in slavery, but I could because I read the book. For either one of you, and I know both of you have read it, right? Kindred. What would be the, I don't even want to ask this question, but could you imagine this for yourself? Like, to wake up, and I'm always fascinated by time travel anyway, but do you think that the way that Octavia Butler handled that, it was scary. At the same time, I was pissed off at the character a lot, found myself angry a lot. Was that on purpose?
I can take it if you want.
Yeah.
If you want me
Yes.
to first. I agree with you. I mean, I wasn't even going to bring it up, but I feel like the plot of the story is a contemporary woman is getting whisked through time, being forced to save the life of a forebear, a white slave master who is eventually going to rape one of her forebears. And so we know this from the beginning, that she's basically protecting a child at first. But as every time she gets sent back, he's older and older and more despicable and more rapey, frankly, where you just want her to kill him, like right away, like immediately, right? It's just like, and it takes a long time, and it takes, and that was frustrating to me. But I think Octavia's point, I think her point in that was that as contemporary African Americans, we like to sit around thinking, oh, well, if I had been born back then, I wouldn't have done this, or I would have been that. And I think this novel was to sort of demonstrate, no, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. You would be scared. You would be trying to save your own life. You would be trying to placate. You would have to suffer the same passage our ancestors did.
And we ain't like that.
I mean, some of them did rise up, but yeah, not everybody.
Yeah.
So that book I came to after, as a much earlier point in my life, seeing the movie Sankofa, Haile Gerima's work, where that is a 1980s, was it 88, maybe 90, something like that. I was like 12. Anyway, we saw it, and that to me first was like, oh, so traveling through space and time, one, that's something that we can do. And we didn't need spaceships to do it, because Mona, the character in that film, is sent back on the words of the ancestor who's there to guard the slave castle that she is violating with her Western ways. And the idea in Fledgling, for me, raised questions about how are we growing or nurturing and protecting or killing the internalized white person within us?
Kindred, you mean?
Kindred.
Yeah, sorry. Did I say Fledgling?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's okay. There's a lot of books. Read them all, y'all. Read them all.
All the books. Thank you for that. What about it? It just raised for me questions about, if we all have been infected with this, and I know we hate the phrase white supremacy. I'm just going to use it because we know what I mean by it. But if we, as much as we despise that part of who we are, it is part of who we are. And as much as we say that, I couldn't have been no slave, all my students, I wouldn't have been no slave. Bro, you just got hemmed up by the cops on your way to school. And are you in the class mad right now because you fit a description that so recognizing that we are still dealing with their system And we are not dismantling their system the same way we say we would dismantle slavery. We are still infected, I think, with an internalized, it's like a little parasitic white national or white ideology that we have not been able to successfully eradicate, despite the fact that many are trying. And we've got Black psychologists doing the work, we've got the therapists doing the work, and we're having conversations about the internalization of white supremacy and all those things. Oh, that's great. But I think there is this mythological belief that we are really a lot better off than we, or a lot more, that whole, I'm not my ancestors. Well, no, you're not, because you couldn't have did what they did. Like, you wouldn't have been able to handle it. Like, you ain't got the range to navigate what they navigated. So this idea that who we are today is somehow better than who we were, to me also is sort of reflective of that idea that thing that happens in third grade when you get to that paragraph and on slavery in your elementary school experience, where you shrink and are embarrassed to hear about it, and you don't want the other kids looking at you because you feel a sense of your own contribution to that shame, which is misplaced. But I think for me, it just raises a lot of questions about how are we raising, nurturing, and protecting the internalized parasitic white thoughts and ideas and beliefs about who we are and our relationship to the world, to God, to ancestors, to change? How are we nurturing that and protecting that as opposed to killing it, which is what a lot of us want to do to that character?
On that, yeah, on that note, Lurie, listen, I want to thank you. As I mentioned, I wanted to have this conversation because I imagine 100 years from now, somebody's going to watch this, and I want them to go on a journey of discovery the way all of us did, to find this woman whose shoulders many of us stand on, those of us who write. And I don't write horror, I do nonfiction, but I love to read. And she broke open something for me that I didn't think was possible, that I could put a Black writer over all, because I grew up on Stephen King, and I'm like, she's better. First was Tananarive Due. I was like, she's better than Stephen King. And I don't want to do that thing because it's not fair. But as a Black person, not being able to see myself in these spaces, to know that there's an Afro future for Black people and that we are responsible for creating it, which is what she did, which is what you do in your works, and Stephen Barnes as well. And Mr. Jennings, who has, if you see this book here as well, John Jennings, who has made that into a comic graphic novel series, which is beautiful and amazing. And I was like, how did you do that? This is such a horrific book in terms of the content, to be able to make it into something that's beautiful as well. And the opera, can you tell us about that again? So that
it's the Parable of the Sower opera. I keep hoping that she will make the recordings public. But basically, it was with the permission of the Octavia Butler estate. It was developed over several years. It's only been mounted a handful of times. Universities, UCLA was one of them. So keep your eyes and ears open, because the music, I swear to you, it is like the soundtrack to Parable of the Sower that nobody knew we were missing until you hear it. And it's like, of course, that's exactly how this book sounds. That's the best way I can explain it.
And how best can we honor the memory and the legacy? I know they say until your name is no longer uttered. So as long as we utter her name, she will always be alive, Octavia Butler. But how else can we honor her memory and the work that she put in?
Just sharing it with a friend, someone who has not yet been introduced. Kindred is a good one to start some people with, because it's not as science fiction-y as some of the other stuff. But other than that, Parable of the Sower is also a great start. It's harsh, but it's a great start.
You're laughing. All right. Well, I pray that I actually know that we will all be here, which is part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation. It is my prayer that all of the horrific things that this woman saw, that we can somehow steer it in another direction, because we have the ability and the power to do that together. So I think we will. And let me say thank you, both of you, for answering the call. I know y'all are incredibly busy, but I think it's important that we at least start these breadcrumbs so that folk can follow. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right. See y'all in the streets. Share, let us know what you think. Follow us on Twitter. Where can they follow you, Lurie?
At Lurie Favors on Twitter, at Lurie Daniel Favors on Instagram and Facebook.
And you, Tananarive?
At Tananarive Due. My name is 10 letters. It's like Tanana, like banana with a T, Rive. And then my last name is Due, Tananarive Due on Twitter and Instagram.
Oh, I need to talk with you because I had this marketing plan for the last 15 years that's been in my head with you. So eventually we'll work together. Eventually.
Wait to hear it.
Love you guys.
Thank you.